I see that we have about 12 participants on right now. I'm sure a few more will matriculate through in the coming minutes. But welcome everybody to the fiscal year 2021 Adult Drug Court and Veterans Treatment Court Grant webinar. My name is Jordan Martinson, and today we're going to be covering this solicitation's funding areas, grant eligibility, categories, and requirements. And we're going to review some of the application sections and go through a brief Q&A portion. Hopefully we'll have a good amount of time to take your questions at the close of the webinar. But firstly, let's do some introductions with our panel today. So once again, my name's Jordan. I'm from the Tlpi, Wisconsin. I'm Ojibwe. And our community is located in northwestern Wisconsin, but I currently work from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, Southern California office. For those that may not be familiar with TLPI, we're a Native American run and operated nonprofit, and we provide training, produce educational materials, including publications on wellness courts, and serve as the primary provider of technical assistance to many BJA tribal grantees. So right now, I'll just briefly turn it over to Lauren and then Greg to introduce themselves as well.
Hi, thank you, Jordan. Lauren Van Schilfgaard. I am Coach de Pueblo, calling from Los Angeles, traditional Tongvan Tlpi.
Oh, sorry, Lauren, it looks like you cut out briefly. And Greg, maybe you can just go until Lauren's internet reestablishes.
Okay, hello everyone, and my name is Gregory Terrain. I am the policy advisor who oversees the BJA Adult Drug Court and Veteran Treatment Court program. I'm really excited to be here today. Hopefully get a chance to respond to many of your questions you may have about the solicitation. Really hope you all, apply for the solicitation, and hopefully, I know you'll receive an award if you apply, as long as you have a good application, correct, right? But yeah, definitely look forward. For those who may not was able to participate on today's webinar, please send a message out to them and have them apply. So again, welcome everyone, and I'm excited about you guys having the opportunity to hear about today's webinar.
And it just looks like Lauren's having a slight internet connectivity issue, but we'll just let her introduce herself when she gets back onto the webinar. But both Greg and Lauren are very knowledgeable about this RFP process. So feel free to drop any questions you may have into the chat box as we go through this webinar. And we'll make sure to collect those and either answer them in the chat box itself or address them at the close of today's webinar. I should highlight that TLPI is planning on providing some follow-up training regarding grant writing generally. So keep your eyes peeled for that and contact us at our email listed in the slide here, and then we'll go from there. So you're all going to get hit with a lot of information today since we're taking a lot of the information verbatim from this solicitation, but it's important to go through them line by line, similar to the way that you'll be preparing your grant proposal itself. So just bear with me, and we'll try to make this as useful to all of you as possible. Keep in mind that today's webinar will be recorded, and we'll also distribute the materials and the recording of this webinar to attendees when we close today's webinar as well. You'll see the @wellness address. That is for TLPI technical assistance questions, and Greg's email is also listed there. So what's our goal today? So first, I just want us all to become familiar with the requirements of this solicitation specifically and how it differs from others, which are more specifically aimed at tribes, and how to maximize the likelihood of your program being funded. So yeah, we'll probably just get going with that briefly. Oh, and it looks like Lauren just rejoined. Can you hear me, Lauren?
Yeah, sorry, my power went out.
Yeah, it happens. So there's still time for you to introduce yourself before we get going.
Yeah, my apologies, everyone. Lauren. I currently work at the UCLA School of Law directing the Tribal Legal Development Clinic, where we have the privilege of working with numerous tribes, including Healing to Wellness courts. We're a clinic, and so I supervise law students doing projects on behalf of clinics, predominantly code drafting, but we do all sorts of work. But formerly, I served at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, working intimately with Jordan and Greg on Healing to Wellness courts, including specifically on these grant proposals, covering general technical assistance and training like this webinar, as well as working with individual applicants. And so I have had the privilege of becoming very familiar with the various solicitations, including CTAS, as well as the specific drug court solicitation. So I'm here as sort of like an old owl giving a large, zoomed out perspective of what this application is and what, some of the components are. And then I may have worked with some of you. I can't unfortunately see everyone's face and affiliation, but if I did, say hello. And then I think, as Jordan has likely already said, we welcome Q&As as Jordan is going through a lot of the content of this presentation. I'll be chiming in with my own little tidbits, but I'd also be happy to help engage, including typing any questions in the questions box as we go through the presentation. So thank you, and sorry. I think we're
So yeah, let's get going on to the meat of the solicitation. So as I noted, the information in today's webinar is the exact information that is noted in the solicitation as well. Once again, this is going to make for about 60 slides, but just make sure to note the hard requirements identified in this webinar and in the solicitation itself to increase the likelihood of being awarded for the available funding. Now, this request for proposals is very specific, as opposed to the CTAS solicitation that is also coming due in the early spring. Under Purpose Area 3, that allows tribes a bit more discretion in how to use their allocated funding, but we'll go over how this solicitation, depending on which category you choose to apply for, will be applicable to your program. So when preparing your proposal, take particular care to tailor your responses, once again, to meet the exact requirements noted in this solicitation. Now, specifically, the request for proposals this year is providing funding for tribal programs to address the needs of individuals in the criminal justice system with substance abuse issues, including targeting the needs of veterans. Now, these courts effectively integrate evidence-based substance abuse treatment, random drug testing, equitable sanctions and incentives, and transitional services in judicially supervised court settings with jurisdiction over offenders to reduce recidivism and substance abuse and prevent overdoses. So that's a mouthful, but we'll get into it a little bit more later on in the webinar, how to tie in that RFP with the specific goals and the narrative that you'll be writing for your proposals. If you've previously submitted a proposal, this round in 2021 is pretty similar with a few key differences. So keep an eye on previous materials you put together and reference them when you're preparing for this year's solicitation. Now, there are a couple different court models that we're going to discuss here in the next slide, but any awards under this solicitation is going to require grantees to minimally comply with the 10 key components. Now, an in-depth discussion of the key components is a bit beyond the scope of our discussion today, but feel free to contact TLPI for any training or resources on those key components, as our staff has a wealth of information and experience providing TA specific to the key components. Now, once again, when drafting your proposals, make sure to show an understanding of the key components and exactly how your program plans to follow them in your wellness court programming. So thanks to Greg for highlighting the huge increase in funding for this solicitation over the last few grant cycles. BJA has clearly shown, as indicated in the numbers on this slide, that they are or that they have a great interest in providing funding to tribal drug courts and wellness courts, and this is reflected in the doubling of funding since 2017. So I strongly encourage you all to take a stab at applying for this solicitation. And I believe if you follow the specific requests as highlighted, I like all of your odds of being awarded, as Greg had mentioned. Now, appropriations for the fiscal year 2021 come in at 83 million for adult drug courts and 25 million for veterans treatment courts, totaling 108 million for fiscal year 2021. Now, this big increase in funding is a great opportunity for your tribe or program to obtain funding for an adult healing to wellness court or veterans court program. This solicitation is also posted at bja.gov and will be posted at wellnesscourts.org. And I'll just ask my colleague Janice to drop the links into the chat box for all of your reference. So OJP has identified priority areas applicable to both categories of funding under this solicitation. And they include serving high-risk, high-need participants, following the 10 key components, allowing access to medication-assisted treatment, ensuring equity and inclusion, engaging law enforcement, supporting veterans and tribal communities, and demonstrating an effort to increase swift entry into your programs, which is 50 days or less would be the expectation under this particular grant. There are a few additional priority areas that are applicable to many tribal communities, including both rural communities and high poverty areas. So you may want to look into your specific community's census data to see if your demographics match up with any of these highlighted priority areas. Now, qualified opportunity zones are an additional priority area, and this is a special federal designation, which could also be noted if applicable to your program. And we might be able to throw Greg a few questions on that at the close of the webinar if we have any.
Yeah, Jordan, I just want to add to that. So if you indicate a designation of one of the three priority areas, it increases your score for your overall score of your application. Just add on something.
Thank you, Greg. Once again, the request for proposals and additional information can be found at the BJA link at bja.gov, which will also be dropped into the chat box. We're also going to provide a link to the NDCRC grant writing resources website. And that's a great resource for all of you to take a peek at successful narratives and applications from prior solicitations. So you could probably take those, use them as a template, and you'd be well on your way to providing a complete and likely to be funded application. So why should you apply for this solicitation specifically? So if you're attending today's webinar, you've shown the motivation to access this funding for your tribe or tribal program in your community. And with that being said, if you follow the request for proposal guidelines, once again, you have a really good chance of receiving an award. So that should be motivation enough.
May I just highlight and underscore that point that this solicitation is open to all jurisdictions, state as well as tribal. However, BJA, Greg right here, has really prioritized providing funding to tribes. Like, where are all the tribal applicants? The rate of tribal applicants to tribal grantees is extremely high. And so getting a solicitation in is always, pushing a boulder up a mountain. It's really hard work. But if you can manage to get the solicitation in, the likelihood of getting funded is extremely high for the solicitation, including particularly compared to CTAS. And so if you're looking to fund a healing to wellness court, whether starting a new one or enhancing an existing one, this is a huge bang for your buck.
Thanks, Lauren. So the graph displayed shows past tribal awards. Please disregard the fiscal year 2021 column there. That's just due to my inadequacy with Excel, I believe. But what you'll see is that not a large number of tribes have been awarded in the past, but that is currently increasing. And with a quick snapshot, once again, you'll see you have a good chance with this solicitation. So in 2018, there were 9 awards out of 11 applications. In 2019, there were 4 awards out of 5 applications. And in 2020, there were 8 awards out of 9 applications, where I think all would have been approved, but one was a duplicate. So once again, the success rate under this solicitation is generally higher than others. So I do encourage you all to take a look at submitting a proposal. Couple notes on this solicitation's deadlines. They were extended, so that's good for you out there who are probably responsible for writing multiple grants for your specific programs. But there are 2 deadlines to note. The first is the grants.gov submission being on March 31st, 2021, and the second Just Grants deadline on April 14th, 2021. So speaking of Just Grants, the DOJ will be providing 10 webinar sessions on the application submission process. So we encourage you all to attend at least one of the sessions that are scheduled between February 11th and March 22nd, so you can familiarize yourself with the system. So webinar topics are going to include the bullet list.
Hey, Jordan.
Here. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. Are those 10 webinar sessions, are those all duplicative? And so you only need to attend one of them?
Greg?
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, they're all at the bottom. They're all what it says. Each of them are 90 sessions, and they all contain the same information. So
okay.
Yeah, they're all the same webinar. So you have a number of different dates to attend each one of them. You can have a number of your staff.
And
so it's really open to you to be able to go to that. And to get to that, I would advise you to use Google. Google Just Grants training, and you will be able to find that information under application submission on the Just Grants web link or web page.
Awesome. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah.
So eligibility. So federally recognized tribes are eligible and strongly encouraged to submit an application for categories 1 through 3 for this specific solicitation. A quick reminder, once again, those same deadlines mentioned in the previous slide will also apply to any tribal applications. So eligibility is very broad and broken down by category. So this is an open solicitation, as Lauren had mentioned. It's not just for tribes. So you will be competing against state courts as well. But to clear up some of the confusion from past solicitations, any applicants that are receiving federal funding for a part of its drug court program may apply. However, your program may be ineligible if the funding requested is the same focus area and or court type as you're currently receiving funding for. However, if your current grant funding cycle ends before the start date of this specific grant, you would be eligible. So with that in mind, the period of performance for this solicitation commences on October 2nd, 2021. So if you have a grant that ends prior to October 2nd, 2021, then you should be eligible for this cycle as well. So there are 4 main categories of courts eligible under this solicitation, including the listed subtypes. If you're attending today's webinar, you're likely a tribal representative and you're looking to establish or enhance a tribal healing to wellness court. However, there is funding available for enhancement or implementation of veterans treatment courts as well, should your tribe be interested in applying for that stream of funding as well. So categories 1 through 3 of this solicitation are most likely, once again, to apply to your programs. I anticipate that a good number of you are going to likely apply under category 3, where you're looking to implement or enhance an adult drug court. So that's a pretty ripe area for a proposal that I'd encourage you to take a look at. However, as I mentioned in the previous slide, you can also apply for implementation or enhancement of a veterans treatment court, depending on where your program's at. Now, category 1 under this solicitation is pretty narrow. It provides funding for implementation of a veterans treatment court. This means your program has laid the groundwork and is ready to take further steps to implement your veterans treatment court program. So you'll see here there are some allowable use of funds listed for category 1. Pay attention to that. You'll see treatment, case management, judicial supervision, sanctions and incentive services, and key resources, including housing, relapse prevention, and employment as allowable use of funds. And I think a big one from my work in the field that's identified that your program may benefit from is that transitional housing, relapse prevention, and employment funding stream that you may be able to get. So we're going to delve a little further into allowable use of funds in the next few slides. So here we go. So category 2 under this solicitation regards veterans treatment courts, has a grant maximum of $500,000 with a period of performance of 48 months. Once again, the allowable use of funding goes towards operational veterans treatment courts to scale up capacity or enhance your current veterans treatment court capacity. If there are any tribal operating veterans treatment courts out there, TLPI would love to hear from you and collaborate in the future. And we'd just like to see what's out there in terms of services available for Native veterans. So if you're looking to launch, reboot, or like enhance an existing wellness court program, category 3 is probably the area that you're going to want to apply under. So just depending on where you're at, are you starting a new program? Do you have an existing wellness court? Either way, you can apply under category 3. Now you'll see ready to fully implement is noted in the right column of this slide, meaning that you've completed a good amount of planning and you're ready to implement evidence-based drug court practices into your program. Also listed here, once again, are allowable uses of funding. And a big one highlighted here is providing access to or enhancing treatment capacity. So it's a great way to find some funding under category 3 to increase your treatment capacity and enhance court operations.
Hey, Jordan, I just wanted to add one extra thing, just as a note. So for categories 1, 2, and 3, you see there's a grant maximum and a period of performance. Just want to make you aware that the grant maximum means you can request up to that amount. You can also request under that amount. You can request 200,000, you can request 250, just depending on what your need is based off within your application. Then also period of performance. again, that's up to 48 months. So we increased that from last year. I think it was 38 months. But you can request also $200,000 for 24 months. We would want you to request the maximum amount, grant amount, and the maximum performance, but it's up to your court or your health and wellness court or what you need. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's really good clarification. Thanks, Greg. Now, this solicitation notes opioid abuse and reduction as a particular area of focus. So with that in mind, make sure to identify in your proposal narrative how your program plans to address opioid abuse reduction. Your community may have different problem substances, but for the purposes of like winning an award for this grant, make sure that there is a connection established between the services your program will be providing and how you'll have capabilities to address opioid abuse and reduction. And those capabilities translate really well to addressing other substance abuse issues as well. So a complete application should cover this. Medication-assisted treatment. So MAT should be allowed by your program as evidence-based substance abuse treatment protocol. If you have concerns about a specific like MAT provider in your community or it's not available, you are still eligible. However, under this award, you would be expected to allow access to MAT if it's available. So in the next few slides, we are going to go over a few pieces of information detailed in the solicitation. BJA is aware of medical marijuana and does highlight that it's still illegal under federal law. So until that changes, our programs will be subject to the key component regarding frequent and random testing, and that testing would have to include marijuana screenings as well. Now, the violent offender prohibition has been a restriction common to the adult drug court program. So this is basically a congressional prohibition on the use of grant funds to serve violent offenders. There are exceptions under this solicitation. So note that applicants can serve veterans charged with violent or nonviolent offenses using Veterans Treatment Court funds under Type B of this solicitation. And your courts may choose to use other funds as well to address those justice-involved individuals who may may fall under the designation of violent offenders. However, you would have to keep your funding streams separate for those services under this grant. So a little bit additional detail on the violent offender federal designation. This language is binding when talking about or using federal dollars. So under Section 1, it's defined as an offense punishable by a term of more than 1 year. So what does an effective healing to wellness court look like? The list displayed is a good potential way to organize your proposal. I would advise you to weave this language into your narrative and into your policies and procedures for your program documents as well, since this is a list of key evidence-based practices which have been shown to be effective in drug court practice. So for those of you that are looking to implement, you may just be wondering more generally, what is a drug court? So we have the definition listed here, but in summation, it's a program managed by a multidisciplinary team that responds to offenses and the treatment needs of participants in your programs. So just be familiar with this broad definition as you're developing your grant applications, and frame your program narrative to match this characterization as well. So in the next 10 slides or so, we're going to get kind of into the meat of the application process. So listed here is a verbatim list verbatim materials list for this specific solicitation. So first, create a list of your own and work through these materials as you develop your own application, and follow the same order as they're listed here and listed in the proposal itself. So also, don't try to do all of this at once. This is a pretty lengthy process, just putting all of this together. So get started early and seek assistance from TLPI or BJA if you have any questions or run into any issues with your grant as you're developing it. I'd mentioned earlier that TLPI does plan on hosting a follow-up webinar where we're just going to cover more general grant writing principles and provide additional resources and template documents that may be useful to some of you. So keep an eye out for that, or contact us at wellness@tlpi.org to add you to our email list, and we'll let you know when we host that webinar in the coming weeks prior to the due dates for most of these solicitations.
Speaking of communication, we have a question in the chat box that Greg is probably best to answer regarding notifications for awards and or unsuccessful grant applications.
Yeah, what we normally do each year, we send out notification for both those that receive award as well as those who don't receive an award. And then we also provide additional information for those who don't receive an award to give you an idea of how your application was scored. I saw that it indicated in the question that they didn't receive that information. Sometimes when you apply, depending on where the application is coming from, we normally send it back to the address that's indicated on the application. So there might have been maybe an address switch or something. I'm not quite sure, but we normally send out denial letters for those who didn't receive the award. But I am the policy advisor for the program. I'll give you my contact information again. If you have any questions, definitely reach out to me. I'll say it real quickly. My email address is Gregory, Gregory, period, TORAIN @usdoj.gov. Definitely reach out to me and I'll help you as best I can. Yeah, there it is right there.
Yes,
Thanks, Greg.
yeah.
Oh yeah, Lauren got it out there.
I just wanted to reinforce, Greg actually is the person that you should be emailing and can actually get responses. So this is a very good lead.
Thank you. So listed here are the 4 essential documents that you are going to need for your proposal. So at minimum, remember to include these in your grant proposal. And don't forget the authorization that is required from your tribal government as well, which is depending on your community's specific laws, you might just need your tribal chairman or council to sign off that they are approving your application for this funding. So the critical elements are listed here: the abstract, the narrative, the timeline and task plan, and the budget detail worksheet. So these are all weighted differently, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the next coming slides. So just one moment.
Hey, Jordan, I just want to add one thing too. I just want to remind people of when you're submitting your application as well. One of the things that I notice when the applications come in sometime, and again, like Jordan said, these are the critical elements. If your application doesn't have any of these, then it won't move past peer review or basic minimum requirement, or we call BMR. Some of the things that I do see that happen sometimes when people submit applications is that when they're submitting their final document or uploading one of the, maybe it's the abstract or the narrative, sometimes it comes up blank. It's just because they might have uploaded the wrong document. So just make sure that when you're uploading them in, that you're actually uploading the final document that you want to send up. Because I've seen plenty of times where the proposal narrative is blank, and I think that they meant to send something else. So just want to reiterate that.
Thanks, Greg. So just a little tip, your abstract should be completed last when you're developing your materials and is limited to 400 words. So your abstract is a summary of the entirety of your proposal. So completing all your required documents first is needed so you can accurately summarize those things in your project abstract. So treat each of these requirements listed like a checklist, and you'll have everything you need for a successful application. Make sure, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, for what it's worth, I really see the abstract as like a pass-fail that you want to, get in there, but your peer reviewer is going to be really scrutinizing the narrative itself and not so much the abstract. So like Jordan said, the abstract shouldn't have like different information. It should like very much mirror, as if you like cut and pasted, various phrases from your narrative into the abstract. But otherwise, as a peer reviewer, I like looking at the abstract as a like quick, like, oh, which jurisdiction is this? What were they trying to enhance? Oh yeah, great. And so now I know what I'm looking into. So it's a helpful tip for me, but I'm generally not subtracting that many points based on like the quality of the abstract. And so it shouldn't differ, but I wouldn't otherwise stress about it.
Thanks, Lauren. So we're going to go over program narrative requirements. Now, the four main things that you're going to be looking at when developing your narrative are a statement of the problem, project design and implementation, capabilities and competencies, and your plan for collecting data. I'd mentioned that we dropped a link for where you can access previous successful grant application narratives. So make sure to take a look at those and use those as a template if you don't have anything to work on previously, or contact TLPI and we'd be happy to forward any template documents we may have in our document bank as well. So each of these areas are going to be, each of the four different sections of your narrative are weighted accordingly by score. So you'll see here that under each category, your description of the issue is worth 20% when scoring. Your project design and implementation goes to 40% of your score. Capabilities and competencies, 20%, and your data collection plan would represent 15% of the score. So you'll kind of see how a peer reviewer will be looking at your proposal and weighting each of these sections.
For what it's worth, when I'm drafting a grant application like this, particularly this RFP asks for about 60 pages worth of information, but only gives you 20 pages to give it. And so the real magic is going to be hitting your 20 pages. So when it's like, okay, I'm being asked the impossible of like, there's no way I can fit all of this in here. I use these percentages to guide my page allocation. And so 40%, okay, that's the meat and potatoes, my project design and implementation. That's going to get more pages than my description or my capabilities and competencies, even though I always draft the most beautiful description of the issue and I just want to go on and on and on, I end up cutting a lot of it because it's only 20% and the project design and implementation is more. And so that's not rigid, that's not in stone. And especially depending on, each jurisdiction and each implementation and enhancement, it's going to have different considerations. So if you need to spill over and cut more in another area, that's fine. But that's just a general benchmark to help guide the process.
That's a really good tip. Thanks, Lauren. So yeah, I never even thought of it that way, but that is logical to have the proportion of your narrative match the percentage allocated in this chart. So thanks for that tip. So like I'd mentioned before, when you're prepping your narrative, follow this list like it's a checklist and go in the same order because your reviewer will also be going down a checklist in the same order. So just make it easy on them and it'll make, it'll go a long ways towards you having a successful application.
Bold, underline, and italicize. I have read beautiful writers that have taken these and like spun it and woven like this like incredible document. But it may, like as a peer reviewer, I have a literal checklist that I'm going through to identify whether or not you answered the questions. So I have to, if I have to like tease out and like flip back and forth, now I'm just in a bad mood. And now you have someone in a bad mood, like looking at your grant application. Applicants that will like use subheadings that identify like, scope of the substance abuse problem. Current court's response to the problem. Love it. I love it. It's so easy for me to go. And it makes for an ugly document, like no disputing that. It is not like a pretty, paper, but it is a beautiful grant application. And that's really what we're going for. And I also just wanted to, since I'm here, highlight really quick things that I personally like, which I'm just one person, but when asked about like the nature and scope of the substance abuse problem, I'm less interested in your capacity about like the national substance abuse problem. You don't need to give me stats about like the general state of affairs of like meth versus opioids. I'm interested in your specific jurisdiction, particularly like the stats out of your court, your police department, and your substance abuse treatment center, if you have those. I'm also interested if you don't have those, like why don't you have those? Is that something you want to address? Were you able to cross-reference with neighboring jurisdictions? It's sometimes relevant to include like, generally substance abuse disproportionately impacts Native communities, but I'm only interested in how that's reflected in your community. So especially because space is so critically tight, try just sticking to your own stats. Heavy footnotes to all of these academic sources are great, but they're not going to make or break your application. And if push comes to shove, I would cut those because they're just not relevant. We're interested in your court. And I've seen lots of peer reviewers mark, they didn't give me stats on their court. Like, why didn't they give me that? Even if they don't have it, I wish they would have just said, we don't have that for this reason.
Thanks, Lauren. Now on to time task plan. So your time task plan should include 3 primary pieces of information, including the right column or the 2 right columns in the right column of this slide under objectives, activities and time frame, and person responsible, but just generally you're outlining your goals and objectives and indicating the number of program participants to be served quarterly.
Jerry would be remiss if we didn't note the magic of the time task plan. So like I said, they're asking for 60 pages worth of stuff that you have to squeeze into 20. So it's like kind of bizarre, but you end up having to cut a lot of the details about like the incredible enhancements that you're going to be making. You can include a lot of those enhancements in the time task plan. But like the abstract, there should be no surprises in your time task plan. It should really just be more details, but your time task plan should accurately reflect what is in your narrative. So when I'm like reading an application, it's really comforting for me when I look at the budget and see, yes, they're proposing to buy more drug testing kits. And then I look at the abstract and it says, yes, we want to enhance our drug court by testing more frequently. Great. And then I look at the narrative. We want, we've noticed that a lot of our participants get to phase 4 and then they have this huge setback. And we think in part it's because we're not testing frequently enough. We'd like to test, continuously 3 times a week throughout the course of all 4 phases. Hence, we want to buy more drug tests. Beautiful. There is consistency between all of these, but it's the time task plan that says, okay, we're going to, drug test this, frequently. We're going to test at, the hospital, at the substance abuse treatment center, and at probation. We're going to have trainings, in January, in July, and in November for all of these different individuals to get retrained on how to do drug testing. Same story, but different details, all of which jive together. Like the scary application is where the narratives and the abstract are talking about drug test, but the budget has all of these budget items for all of these curriculums that the court wants to purchase, but they never talked about in their narrative.
So budgets and budget narratives. So what Lauren has kind of touched on is that your budget narrative should not leave any question whatsoever as to the purpose of the requested funds. So what does this mean? So when you're developing your budget narrative, try to make sure to consider the following. So expenses in your budget should match your program narrative. So like just an example that's usually provided is like, don't ask for testing supplies if you haven't included drug testing as a component of your narrative. So just make sure that there is a connection between what's in your narrative and what is in your budget narrative. So when you're preparing your budget narrative, provide an itemized budget for each year of your grant. Now, there is a match required, and we'll get into in-kind match versus cash match in the next slide here. So the match requirement. The match requirement differs, I believe, from the CTAS applications. And a good thing to note is that your match or your tribe's match does not have to be cash. So for example, you could show that key members of your team, specifically like maybe the judge's time or salary, will equate to an in-kind match of funds for your program funding match. Now, what you show in your proposal will be what you're going to be expected to follow, whether it be cash or an in-kind match. So if you propose a match over 25%, you will be held accountable for it. So I wouldn't recommend going that route. Your program can certainly provide additional funding beyond 25%, but at least meet that minimum 25% match, whether it be cash or based on other allocation of your court or tribe's resources. So if you do receive an award under this solicitation, there are several unallowable uses of funding as noted on this slide. I believe this is the same as previous year's solicitations, but a big one is that you can't use funds for food or beverages, and that includes coffee. But in my experience, you can usually find a non-federally funded pot of coffee at the courthouse or a tribal office somewhere if you know where to look.
It also notably does not include incentives. And so for courts that have like a fish bowl or like a pot of like gift cards or even like supplies like toilet paper and toiletries that you offer participants, can't use funds for that, which we would desperately like to change, Greg. We need you to fix that. Also coffee. The poor court needs coffee.
We'll work on that.
And TLPI does have some really good examples of how courts have creatively found resources to fill that gap in funding for gifts and monetary type incentives, those sort of small things. So we'd be glad to share those if you contact us at our wellness court email. So additional attachments. If and when you decide to supplement your application with additional attachments, make sure to reference which category you're applying for and follow as listed. There's kind of an exhaustive list here for each category. So we can go over them here. So we have category 1 here, where you have to attach your letters of support and interagency agreement from your proposed team members. And then I had highlighted category 3 as well, where you're going to want to attach letters of support, interagency agreements from your proposed team members. And letters of interagency agreement. So if you needed some help with example template documents for these type of attachment documents, also feel free to contact a TLPI and we'd be glad to help. So the list here just shows a number of example supplementary attachments that can be added to your application materials. Some of these aren't required, but they can serve to strengthen different portions of your application. I noted earlier the tribal authorizing resolution, which would be applicable to your grant proposal, where based on your tribe's laws and regulations, you'll probably need authorization from your council or a identified representative with the authority to recognize that you have permission to submit a proposal for these funds. So I just touched on that accidentally, one step too early, but once again, the tribal authorizing resolution is just a document from your tribal government approving your proposal. And this just kind of makes sure that there aren't like third parties or random individuals applying for this funding. So that kind of just verifies that you have the consent of your tribal government to apply for the funds. So there's a list here of required documents and links to those documents in the solicitation. They are the same as previous year's solicitations, but once again, take a note of this and make a checklist. Don't forget to upload these documents that are listed here with your application. So the application references the NADCP standards. If you're not familiar, feel free to visit nadcp.org to familiarize yourself with these concepts. But each of these resources go over research that's been shown to correlate with successful practices for wellness and drug courts. So TLPI is also available to provide training on these standards. And the tribal 10 key components would also be, or we'd have training available on the tribal 10 key components as your programs may need.
I just wanted to note, especially as far as like putting together a grant proposal goes, you don't need to do a dissertation on the 10 key components or on the standards. But I will note, if you're looking with fresh eyes, it's a little bit confusing because you have these 10 key components and you have these 10 standards, and they're not a one-to-one ratio. They overlap significantly, but the standards are different than the 10 key components. And so what I might like to see in a grant application is that, like, yes, we're going to have a multidisciplinary team, and then C key component, whatever, C standard, whatever, informing the research supporting the use of a multidisciplinary team. We're going to drug test twice a week, see the tribal key component and the corresponding standard. And really, it's just to showcase to the reader that, like, not only are we familiar with what the 10 key components call for and what the standards reinforce as a research-based foundation, but we are actively implementing the key components and the standards in our Healing to Wellness court, so that we're not only promoting the best practices, but we're also doing it in a way that is the most responsive to our own, unique tribal community. So being able to, like, convey all of that at once is really tricky, but like the general stuff, like, I was saying with, like, the, heavy footnotes around, like, the problem of substance abuse in Native communities generally, you similarly don't need to give us a whole paper on what the key components and the standards are. The peer reviewers know that. All they want to see is that you know that. So referencing them in the, like, relevant ways is enough to do that.
Thank you, Lauren. So here's just a general breakdown of the two standards. So under volume 1, these resources touch on target population, disadvantaged groups, the judges' roles and responsibilities, incentives and sanctions, and substance abuse treatment. Now, volume 2 covers treatment and social services, drug and alcohol testing, your multidisciplinary team, census and caseload, and monitoring and evaluation. This request for proposals acknowledges the Tribal Healing to Wellness Court key components, and these are the critical aspects of your programs that your programs will be following. So these standards are a little more tailored to tribal communities and tribal programs and tribal participants as well, with focuses on the unique distinctions of different tribal communities. So another distinction of the tribal 10 key components is a focus on culture and tradition as tools to bring about healing in our communities. So once again, TLPI has provided or developed a publication specifically on the tribal 10 key components, and we would be happy to provide those resources to you or any related training should you need. So sometimes providing guidance on not what to do is probably equally as important as providing guidance on what to do for these grant applications. So the number one thing that I would say is to provide all required documents at minimum. That's what Greg had touched on earlier. Just go down the checklist and make sure you have those minimal documents before you get into the weeds, and then build from there. Secondly, you should closely link connections between sections of your application, including the statement of the problem and program design, and budget and program activities. I don't know if Greg or Lauren had anything additional for this one. If you do, just let me know.
Yeah, I'll just say one thing. Just make sure that when you're the budget or the amount that you're requesting, should match on the abstract, should match on the budget detail worksheet, and should match on the 424, the application form. So your budget should match on each of the forms. You should have a different budget for each one, just so that it's not confusing for the reviewer or for us at BJA, what you're actually requesting, the total amount you're requesting.
So I'll like throw this in, especially because I know for a lot of us, it's a different person that's putting the budget together, which can like sort of like make the process really bumpy. But as a peer reviewer, when I'm like just opening a fresh application and I want to get a sense of it, I'll open the budget first to get a sense of like, where are the dollars going? Like what's really at stake here? And then sort of read the application, you know, with the abstract and the narrative and see if those line up. And so I would keep that in mind as you're putting this together, that does the budget, like what story is the budget telling? And obviously it's just a budget, it can't tell the whole story, but it should certainly reinforce whatever story we're telling in the narrative.
So tips, once again, start your application as early as possible. So you're allowing yourself enough time to fill in any gaps or send in any questions that you may have or if you encounter any issues, you'll have plenty of time to rectify those. So let's see. I don't know, Lauren or Greg, if you had any additional tips, once again, just let me know.
I once had an application where they were trying to get out of the page limit by putting it on legal size paper. So it was like whatever, 17 by 11 and a half. Don't do that. Like the formatting automatically readjusts. So it ended up that their narrative was like all over the place and wasn't consistent on the pages. And it just totally sabotaged their entire application. Stick to like regular size paper. And I would really stick to the 12 point font, Times New Roman, double spaced. Funky fonts, funky formatting is distracting. And whether or not it's intentional, it makes you look like you're trying to hide something. And that's obviously like not what we want to do. And so like be rigid about your formatting.
Yeah, and this is Greg. I'll just add a tip, and I think Lauren talked about a little bit earlier. You know, when you're writing your grant, when you're going through the program narrative, one of the things I used to do as a grant writer a while back is that in that section, each section, pull it apart and to make sure you respond to each question in the order it's in. So when you're going through the program narrative, you're doing a statement piece, you want to go through the application and just cut the first question, respond to that question, cut the next question, respond to that question. That way you're going through each of the questions in the solicitation and you're responding to them. And you're also responding to them in the order that the peer reviewer will be reviewing them. So that's always a good thing. I call it creating a skeleton. I cut and paste each question and leave space underneath it so that I can provide a response to each question. And if I don't know the response, then I'm looking to see, because there may be a gap in my capacity to address that question. So then I'm looking at who are partners in our community that we haven't looked at that can be a part of this application, who can support that gap in service. So that you'll be able to respond to that because then you brought in new partners. And the other piece I'll say is the strongest applications that we do get are the ones that have the strongest partners, have a good, strong partnership with other community providers in the area that you link to within your application.
One more tip. When you are submitting your documents, be cognizant of how you have labeled the document, like what it's saved in the top bar. That's frequently the only thing that the reviewer will see. And so if it's like, you know, just narrative, it's hard for the reviewer to know like, well, whose narrative is this? I'm looking at like 20 different narratives. So include like your tribal name or your court's name, you know, narrative, attachment 1 of 7 or whatever it is, just to give like a real clear guide map of just based on the name of the document, what this is and what universe it's living in.
Great tips, thank you. So we had a question on this earlier, but let's see, if you're to have an unsuccessful application, so in the event that you don't receive an award, don't be discouraged. There are funding cycles annually, and if you touch base with Greg and BJA, they should be able to provide the information you need to be awarded in the subsequent solicitation. However, I'm confident that you all will meet the requirements to be funded this year, and we'd be happy to help with any technical assistance any of you may need with your programs. So here we're just going to go over some quick TLPI resources, and then we're going to move into questions as quickly as possible in case any of you have any. And we can even unmute some of you if you wanted to vocalize some of the questions, or if you wanted to type your questions into the chat box, feel free to do that as well. So listed here are a list of our general Tribal Law and Policy Institute publications that I would suggest familiarizing yourself with as you develop and or enhance your wellness court programs, and the links are provided here. TLPI is available to provide technical assistance in partnership with Justice for Vets to help you enhance and or implement a tribal veterans court should you get an award under the solicitation. Listed here is wellnesscourts.org, where you can find additional details about TLPI, previous conference materials, recorded resources, and a wealth of additional wellness court related resources. This is my contact information. Once again, these slides will be made available to you, and feel free to contact us at any time should you have any questions or need any additional assistance with your wellness court programming. One additional note, for those of you that have operating wellness courts, TLPI is working in collaboration with the National Drug Court Resource Center to develop and distribute a wellness court specific survey. So if you have an existing court, I would love for any of you to submit a response with information about your court, and hopefully that information will be able to benefit everybody, where we can see kind of what's out there in terms of training needs, competencies, and any innovative practices that are going on in the field. This is an additional link here to BJA grant application resources, and there's a live link here in the slide. An additional link for Just Grants technical support information, including the phone number should you have any questions. And an additional link for technical support. So now we do have some time for questions. I see we still have about 18 people on the webinar, and we can open it up to anything that you may have in terms of questions or concerns. I don't see any open questions right now. We'll just wait a minute though, should any of you have anything additional.
Well, I just wanted to note in the, all of the other RFPs out there are predominantly CTAS. Your wellness court, because it is a collaboration between multiple different agencies, it's so tricky, right? And it's so hard to find where the home for the wellness court is, who's going to take ownership for it. But at least in this instance, it's an asset because you can leverage multiple different funding streams to support the wellness court. including accessing something like this BJA drug court specific RFP that really wants tribes to apply, while also applying for some different part of the wellness court via CTAS. And so, you know, it's really about stamina. How many grant applications can you like sit down and write, which is a real thing. But assuming you have support and capacity, do it. Like leverage everything. Wellness courts are in a unique like category with different funds that are available. And if you had to pick one though, I think this one is a really good one because tribes, it's just underutilized by tribes right now, and you can save CTAS for another component of the justice system.
Then I see an additional question. Just to clarify, a recording of this webinar will be available at the BJA website as well as wellnesscourts.org, and we can send those to participants as well after close of today's webinar. A couple more questions here.
Yeah, I think someone wanted to see the slide with the match, the 25% match.
Sure. Let's go back through. Oh, there we are.
Yeah, so I think this is an important slide, right? Because it shows that you can still, you know, access like a full $500,000 of like federal dollars that you want to apply for. But the match assumes that you're going to have a 25% match. So that means that the $500,000 of like cash that the federal government is sending is only 75% of like the total budget, right? Because if we were going to take like 25% of just the 500,000, well, now suddenly the actual number of federal dollars that is being sent is less. So assuming you want $500 from the feds, that means they're sending in 75%, you need to provide another 25%. And to Jordan's point, I think it's extremely common. Many courts, both tribal and non-tribal, will frequently list the judge's salary as a portion of that makes up the 25% match for the stuff. But prosecutor salary, case manager salary, whatever, you know, if it's already being paid for, you can frequently show like they're putting in significant hours into the healing to wellness court. Their salary derives from a different source. There's our 25% match. But to Greg's point, don't overmatch. Whatever you're committing to, that's a commitment that you're making pursuant to the grant. And so like it should be minimal. They ask for a 25% match, don't offer a 50% match.
That's really good clarification on this slide. I'm glad that that question was identified. Is there anything else that anyone had? I still see we have a couple participants on here, so feel free to shoot in questions. We'll keep it open for a minute or two just in case anything comes to mind as you're probably scribbling down notes right now.
Yeah, I'm out of the game, but I can just tell like with, you know, it was always an issue with GMS and it sounds like it's still an issue now with just grants, like same but different, which means as an applicant, and especially as tribal applicants where we've got like multiple different departments that need to review this, we've got budget that needs time to like go over everything, and likely a different department that actually needs to do the submission process for us. You know, reverse engineer that, build in lots of time, and as much as feasible, though I know we've been guilty of this, try not to upload your grant the day of the deadline because everybody else and their mom is going to be uploading it on the last day. And I don't want to point, not this just grants, but other federal grant software has crashed before. And the victims of that is us. That means that we don't get to submit our grant application and it's not eligible. And so don't let that happen to you. Submit like ahead of time, which means like, you know, we have to figure out the internal bureaucracy of all our departments and all the approvals that are necessary, and everyone that needs to read this beforehand. All of that needs to be buttoned up, well in advance before the submission deadline.
And while there's some blank space here, you all will be prompted to complete an evaluation after today's webinar. So just please take a minute to fill in the information as best you can, because we use that to try to always improve these types of webinars for you in the future. Okay, we'll leave it open for about one more minute. I don't see any more questions, and then we can close if nothing else comes in. But thank you all again for attending today's webinar. And I wish you all the best of luck as you prepare these proposals. And I'm sure you're all going to hit it out of the ballpark. And hopefully we have a record-breaking number of tribal grantees for next year's batch of awards.